The bridge was collapsing, the river was rising, and every able-bodied man in Dry Mesa stood frozen on the bank, watching. Every man except one. He wasn't the sheriff, wasn't the cowboy they wrote songs about. He was the blacksmith, the one nobody ever looked at twice, and he was already waist-deep in freezing water, tools strapped across his back, moving toward the wreckage while everyone else moved away. That night, Dry Mesa would learn something it should have known for years. The man holding this town together had never once asked for credit. If this story speaks to you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The Man Behind the Smoke. Dry Mesa, Texas, November 1886. The forge never slept. Long before the roosters on the edge of town announced anything useful, before the saloon swept last night's sawdust off its floorboards, before even the baker fed wood into his oven, the forge at the eastern edge of Dry Mesa was already breathing. Red-orange light pulsed against the pre-dawn dark like a second heartbeat, and the rhythmic clang of iron on iron tapped out its steady, unromantic measure against the silence of the Texas plains. Rowan Hale had been awake since 4. He was always awake since 4. He stood at the anvil now, hammer rising and falling in that particular unhurried way that looked almost lazy until you noticed the precision behind it. Each strike landing exactly where it needed to, not a fraction of an inch off. He was working on a wheel rim, one he'd been asked to fix yesterday morning by Cal Briggs, who ran the grain wagon between Dry Mesa and the mill at Porter Creek. Cal needed it done by sunup. Cal always needed everything done by sunup, and Cal had never once said thank you in the 3 years Rowan had been doing business with him. That was just the nature of things. Rowan wasn't bitter about it, or if he was, he'd buried the bitterness so deep it no longer had a name. At 22, he had the hands of a man twice his age. The knuckles were thick, the skin across his palms was cross-hatched with old burn lines. Thin silver seams where molten iron had spat or sparks had caught. His forearms were ropey with muscle that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with survival. He wasn't a tall man, maybe 5'11", and he carried himself with the slight forward lean of someone who spent most of his life bent over work. Not defeated, just perpetually focused on the thing directly in front of him. His face was plain in the way working faces get plain, nothing striking, nothing memorably ugly. Brown eyes that watched more than they spoke. A jaw that needed shaving about twice a week, whether he got around to it or not. His dark hair was almost always damp at the temples from the heat of the forge. Nobody wrote poems about Rowan Hale. Outside, Dry Mesa was beginning its slow, reluctant wake-up. He could hear it through the open side door of the smithy, the creak of wagon wheels on the main drag, a dog's complaint about something, a woman's voice calling a name from a porch somewhere. The town had maybe 400 people in it, enough to have a church, a schoolhouse, a sheriff's office, 3 saloons, and enough pride in itself to pretend it was bigger than it was. It was a hard country. The plains around Dry Mesa had a way of reminding people of that daily. The sky too wide, the wind too uninterested in human problems, the summer heat that could pull the moisture right out of a man before he realized he was dying. Winter came differently, but no kinder. The cold that settled over the Texas panhandle in November didn't announce itself with drama. It just arrived, flat and serious, and anyone who wasn't prepared for it learned the lesson the hard way. Rowan was already thinking about winter. The past 2 weeks had brought unusual rain, and the creek that ran a quarter-mile south of the main road, folks just called it Dry Creek, which was a lie about 9 months of the year, was running higher than he'd seen it in November. The old bridge over it, the one the whole town used to reach the southern rangelands, was already looking tired. He'd mentioned it once to Sheriff Dale Pruitt last week, pointed out that 2 of the support beams on the eastern side were showing corrosion, that the iron brackets holding the main plank structure were undersized for the traffic load. Pruitt had nodded. The way men nod when they're not going to do anything about what you're telling them, but don't want to have a conversation about it. "I'll look into it," Pruitt had said. He hadn't. Rowan had filed the thought away in the part of his mind where he kept all the things that worried him and that he had no authority to fix without someone asking him to. It was a crowded filing cabinet. The wheel rim was done by 5:30. He set it against the wall, drank half a tin cup of water that had gone cold from the night, and pulled out the next job. A set of plow blades for the Henderson farm, which had broken during the last hard freeze when Jim Henderson's son tried to work ground that wasn't ready. He'd been angry at the blades when he brought them in, as if the iron were at fault for being pushed past its limits. Rowan had taken the blades without argument and said they'd be ready Thursday. It was Thursday. He was halfway through the second blade when he heard boots on the wooden step outside, and then Thomas Garrett's red face appeared in the doorway. Thomas was 11 years old and the unofficial messenger of the Garrett household, which meant he showed up at irregular hours with problems that never waited. "My ma says the pump handle broke again," Thomas announced. He had a smear of something across his chin that might have been jam. "She says it's the same spot as last time, and can you come look at it today?" Rowan set the hammer down. "She send money?" Thomas's expression made clear that the concept of money had not entered the morning's conversation. "Tell her I'll come by this afternoon," Rowan said, "and tell her to use the bucket from the well until then." "She said to ask, could you maybe—" "This afternoon, Thomas." The boy nodded and disappeared. Rowan picked up his hammer. This was most of his life, in its honest form. Not glory, not recognition, just the steady, unremarkable work of keeping things from falling apart. The tools, the wagons, the pumps and hinges, and wheel rims and plow blades that held this town's daily survival together in ways nobody thought about until something broke. He didn't resent it, mostly. There were mornings when something darker moved through him, when he'd look at the cracked skin of his hands or the burns on his wrists and think, is this it then? Is this the whole shape of it? But those mornings usually passed before the sun got above the roofline, burned off like the frost on the grass. He had work to do. Work had a way of not leaving room for self-pity, and Rowan had always been grateful for that, even when he wasn't grateful for much else. The new school teacher arrived on a Tuesday in early November, on the afternoon stage from Amarillo. Rowan didn't see it happen. He heard about it the way he heard about most things in Dry Mesa, secondhand through fragments of other people's conversations, the way background noise assembles itself into information if you're paying attention. He was at the hardware counter in Dawson's general store, picking up a new file and a box of iron rivets, when Mae Dawson, who was 63 years old and had appointed herself the town's primary chronicler of social events, mentioned it to the woman at the dry goods counter. "Stage brought a school teacher," Mae said, in the particular tone she used for things she had opinions about. "Young woman traveling alone, from back east, they say. Philadelphia, or somewhere like that." "Young?" the other woman said. "Young enough. Pretty enough that some of the men at the stage stopped, forgot their manners." Mae's tone communicated clearly what she thought of those men. She's replacing old Mercer, no relation to Colt, who left in September. The school board hired her sight unseen, apparently, which I'm sure they'll have thoughts about once the novelty wears off. Rowan paid for his rivets and his file, and didn't give the matter further thought. He had other things to think about. He met her 4 days later, and it wasn't the way stories usually arrange these things. No dramatic first moment, no locked eyes across a crowded room. She came to the smithy on a Friday morning holding a broken door hinge from the schoolhouse, looking slightly uncertain whether she had the right address, which was a reasonable uncertainty because Rowan had never gotten around to putting a sign up. "Is this the blacksmith?" she asked from the doorway. "Yes, ma'am." She came inside a few careful steps, the way people did when they weren't sure of their footing, and looked around at the organized scatter of the smithy, iron stock in bundles along one wall, tools hung in their places, the forge breathing quietly in its corner, the anvil scarred from years of use. She was looking at it the way a person looks at a place that turns out to be more interesting than they expected. "I'm Eliza Rowan," she said. "I'm the new school teacher." She paused. "Your name is Hale." "Rowan Hale, yes, ma'am." "Rowan," she repeated, and there was a small smile in it, something she wasn't making a performance of. "We share a name, then, in different arrangements." "I suppose we do." He came forward to take the hinge she was holding. It was a simple thing. The pin had sheared, and one of the leaf plates had warped. Someone had tried to hammer it back roughly and made it worse. He turned it over in his hands once, quickly reading it the way he read all damaged things, finding the history of its failure in the shape of the break. "How long has the door been hanging wrong?" he asked. "Since I arrived. It doesn't close properly. Won't latch. I've been propping it with a chair." She hesitated. "The children think it's funny. I don't. The pin's been gone a while. See how the plate's bent here? Someone forced it closed too many times before it finally let go. He set it on his workbench. I can have it done by this afternoon. You can pick it up, or I can bring it by and hang it for you. The mounting holes might need to be re-drilled, depending. I'd appreciate if you could bring it, she said. I wouldn't want to hang it wrong. I'll come by around 4. She nodded. And then instead of leaving, she stayed where she was and looked at the forge for a moment. Does it ever stop? She asked. What's that? The fire. Do you ever let it go out? He looked at the forge. The way you look at something so familiar, it's almost invisible. Banking it every night, he said. Get it going again before dawn. It's easier than starting from nothing every time. Keeps the metal at temperature. How long have you been doing this? Since I was 50, apprenticed under the man who had the shop before me. He died 2 years ago and left it to me. She looked at him then, directly, which he found mildly uncomfortable in the way directness sometimes was when he wasn't expecting it. That's a long time to tend a fire, she said. He didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't offer one. She said she'd see him at 4, and she left, and Rowan went back to work. He thought about it later, that conversation, which had been nothing remarkable on its surface, and couldn't entirely identify why he kept turning it over. It wasn't that she was pretty, although she was, in an unflashy way that had more to do with the way she paid attention than anything about how she looked. It was something else. Most people who came to the smithy talked about what they needed and left. They didn't ask questions about the fire. He told himself it was nothing and went to sleep. He showed up at the schoolhouse at 4 with the hinge repaired and 2 new mounting screws because he'd guessed right about the holes. Eliza met him at the door, which was, indeed, hanging off its proper axis in a way that explained the chair, and stood aside while he worked. The schoolhouse smelled like chalk and wood shavings, and the particular sweetness of children who'd been recently removed from the premises. Desks were aligned with a precision that suggested Eliza Rowan was a person with opinions about disorder. A map of the United States was pinned to the wall, and beside it, someone had hung a hand-drawn picture of a horse in brown crayon, clearly the work of a student, signed Bobby, in letters that took up a third of the paper. One of yours? Rowan asked, nodding at the horse drawing while he set the hinge in place. Eliza glanced over. Bobby Marsh, he wants to be a rancher. He's 7. A pause. He draws a horse on everything, the margins of his arithmetic exercises, the back of his speller. I've stopped confiscating them. Does he ride? His father won't let him near the horses yet, says he's too small. She folded her arms, watching Rowan line up the mounting holes. I think Bobby would disagree. Most 7-year-olds would. He drilled the new holes with a hand bit, set the screws, and tested the swing of the door. It moved cleanly, latched on the first try. He stood back. There, he said. Eliza opened and closed the door twice, the way people do when they're verifying something they already know works. Perfect, she said. What do I owe you? 15 cents for the screws. Hinge repairs nothing. She looked at him steadily. Nothing isn't a price. It's a short job, he said. Call it 20 cents total, and we'll both be square. She paid him 25 and didn't give him room to argue about the difference, which he found either irritating or amusing. He wasn't sure which. Well, shit. Colt Mercer rode into the visible center of Dry Mesa's social life the way he always had, easily, and with the specific unconscious confidence of a man who had never had to wonder if he was welcome somewhere. He was 28, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened face that looked like it had been assembled specifically to appear trustworthy. And he could ride anything with 4 legs and most things with an engine, which made him something close to legendary in a county that still measured a man's worth largely in terms of what he could do on horseback. Colt was a good man. That was the honest truth of it, and Rowan, who had known him since childhood, who had repaired his tack and shoed his horses and occasionally shared a drink with him, would have been the first to say so. Colt didn't have a mean bone in his body. He was generous in the sprawling, effortless way that people are generous when generosity has never cost them anything. He laughed easily. He remembered names. He showed up when people needed help moving things or fixing fences. He was also, without trying to be, exactly what Dry Mesa thought a hero looked like. He noticed Eliza Rowan on her second week in town, which surprised no one, because Colt noticed most things worth noticing, and Eliza, With her steady eyes and her Philadelphia straight-spined manner and the way she held a conversation like it was something worth taking seriously was worth noticing. "New school teacher seems like good people," Colt said to Rowan one evening at the edge of the saloon, both of them standing outside with their drinks because the inside was too loud and the night air, though cold, was cleaner. "You met her yet?" "She came in about a hinge," Rowan said. "What'd you think?" Rowan thought about the question longer than Colt probably expected. "She asked good questions," he said finally. Colt looked at him. "That's it? That's your read on her?" "I repaired a hinge, Colt. I wasn't writing a character assessment." Colt laughed and shook his head and said something about Rowan being the least romantic man in the county, which was probably accurate. Then he said he was thinking about asking Eliza to the church social the following Saturday, and what did Rowan think? Rowan thought he would say the wrong thing regardless of what came out of his mouth. So he said, "She seems like the type who'd want to be asked properly, not like you're doing her a favor." Colt considered this with more seriousness than Rowan expected. "Fair point," he said. They finished their drinks, and Rowan walked home to the small two-room house behind the smithy, and he lay on his back in the dark for a while without sleeping, which was an unfamiliar discomfort. The first snow of the season came on a Saturday in mid-November. Not a real snow, just the thin, apologetic kind that coated everything in an inch of white and melted off the road by midday. But it was enough to signal what was coming. Rowan spent that morning making deliveries. The Henderson plow blades, finally, and a set of new barrel hoops for the Cooper on Front Street, and a replacement axle pin for the Dawson delivery wagon. He was on his way back through the main street when he nearly walked into Eliza, who was coming out of the general store with a paper-wrapped parcel in both arms and not quite enough eyes free to navigate. He caught the parcel before it hit the ground. She caught her own balance independently, which suggested her reflexes were sound. "Sorry," they said at the same time, and there was a brief, awkward rearrangement as he handed the parcel back and she got a proper grip on it. "Thank you," she said, and then, recognizing him, "Mr. Hale." "Miss Rowan." She had a wool coat on, dark blue, practical, and a scarf that looked like it had been tied in the dark, which he privately found endearing, though he would not have used that word or any word like it to describe the thought. "Buying out the store?" he asked, nodding at the parcel. "Chalk. And some paper. The school is running low on both." She shifted the weight. "I didn't realize chalk came in such quantities. It's heavier than you'd think." "I wouldn't have thought about it," he admitted. "Most people haven't," she said, and it wasn't unkind. "How's the forge? Still burning?" "Still burning." She looked at him with that particular quality of attention she seemed to bring to most things. Focused, unhurried, like she was actually interested in the answer and not just filling silence. "I drove past it this morning," she said, "before dawn. I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk, which was foolish, given the cold, but I saw the light from the forge from a block away. Orange against all that dark. It looked," she seemed to be considering the right word, "permanent, like it had always been there." Rowan looked down at the road for a moment. "Almost 7 years," he said. "More or less." "Since you were 15. "Since I was 15. She shifted the parcel again, and he said, without thinking, "I can carry that for you." She opened her mouth. He could see the independent streak in her preparing to say, "I'm fine, thank you." And then she looked down at the size of the parcel and made a practical decision. "Thank you," she said, and handed it over. They walked toward the schoolhouse side by side. It was 3 blocks. Neither of them rushed it. "How do you like it here?" he asked. "Compared to Philadelphia." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something more complicated. "It's honest," she said. Philadelphia was social. There were a lot of layers between what people said and what they meant. Here, at least, you can see the problem directly. The weather, the distance, the work that needs doing. It's right in front of you. Is that better? "I think so." She paused. "Though I admit I miss libraries. There's no library here." "No. Bobby Marsh's horse drawings are the most public art available," Rowan said before he decided to say it. "There's a collection of books at the back of Dawson's. May Dawson keeps them in a crate. Her husband ordered them years ago and never got around to selling them. She lends them out informally. Most people don't know they're there." Eliza stopped walking. Not dramatically. just a half-step pause, the kind that meant something had surprised her. "Is that right?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "She keeps them behind the winter boots, shelf on the left as you go in the back room." Eliza looked at him for a moment. "How do you know about that?" "May Dawson talks a lot," he said. "If you're in the store enough, you learn things." He carried the chalk to the schoolhouse. She thanked him. He walked back to the smithy, and the town moved around him the way it always did. Not noticing, not unkind, just elsewhere. Colt took Eliza to the church social on Saturday, and by all accounts they had a fine time. Rowan wasn't at the social because he'd been asked to fix a heating stove at the Harmon Ranch that had chosen an inconvenient moment to stop working, and a family with 4 children in the middle of a cold snap was a more pressing obligation than a church dance. He heard about the social from May Dawson on Monday morning. Colt Mercer was very attentive, May reported, in the tone of a woman reporting scores. Brought her flowers. Somebody's late-season mums, I don't know where he found them. Danced with her twice. She danced with him, but she also danced with the Harmon boy and with George Pfeiffer, so it's not like it was exclusive. A small pause that carried weight. She's not easy to read, that one. Said Rowan, looking at a list of jobs for the week. You didn't go to the social. Had work. May looked at him the way she looked at things she had opinions about, but hadn't quite decided to deploy yet. She was quiet for a moment, which from May Dawson was unusual. She came in last week, May said finally, looking for the book crate. Rowan said nothing. She knew exactly where to find it, May said. Said somebody told her about it. Is that so? Found 2 books she wanted, paid me double what I asked, which I told her wasn't necessary. May paused meaningfully. She said to keep it because whoever had told her about the crate had done her a good turn, and she wanted to pass something forward. Rowan folded his list and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll have that hinge pin ready by tomorrow, May. May let it go. She was observant enough to know when a conversation had reached its limit. But the cold came in earnest the second week of November, dropping temperatures below freezing by nightfall and keeping them there. Rowan moved his routine up an hour, waking at 3 instead of 4, adding extra fuel to the forge, spending extra time at the start of each day, ensuring the fire would hold at the temperature the day's work would demand. One morning, a Thursday, gray and iron-skied, he got to the smithy at his usual time and found, on the work table near the door, where he kept jobs waiting for pickup, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. No name on it. He opened it, which took him a moment because the paper was tied very neatly. Inside was a pair of work gloves. Heavy leather, double-stitched at the seams, sized correctly. Not the generic size that general stores carried, but something closer to his actual hand. Tucked inside one of them was a folded note. The note read, Your hands are what keep this town running. It seems reasonable that someone should try to keep your hands. No signature. Rowan stood at his workbench with the note in his hand for a while. Then he folded it again, put it in the drawer where he kept important papers, and put on the gloves. They were the best-fitting pair he'd ever owned. He didn't ask where they'd come from. He already knew, in the way you sometimes know things you haven't been directly told. He spent the day working in them, noticing how they held up against the heat and the handle of the hammer, and somewhere around noon he allowed himself the thought that perhaps someone had been paying more attention than he realized. He shut the thought down with the efficient practice of a man who had shut down inconvenient thoughts for years, and went back to work. Yes. The bridge worried him. He'd been to look at it himself, on a Sunday when the rest of the town was occupied with other things. Walked the planking slowly, pressed his boot against the eastern support, knelt down to look at the iron brackets where they bolted into the beam. It was bad. Worse than he'd estimated from the road. The main eastern bracket had visible rust fractures running along its lower edge. Deep ones, the kind that didn't show from a distance, but opened up significantly under pressure. The mounting bolts were loose enough that he could move them by hand. The plank decking on the south side was soft in 2 places, rot getting in under the surface, which the recent rain had accelerated. It could hold regular wagon traffic for another few weeks, maybe. Maybe. But if a loaded freight wagon came through, or if the creek came up any further and added stress to the pilings, he walked back to town and went to Sheriff Pruitt's office. I need you to look at the bridge, Rowan said. Pruitt was behind his desk eating a late lunch, a man who had been comfortable long enough that discomfort was now primarily theoretical. "I looked at it last week," Pruitt said. "I looked at it this morning. The eastern bracket is cracked. Not surface level. The fractures go deep. If you put a loaded wagon over it in the next 2 weeks..." "Rowan." Pruitt set down his fork with the patience of a man managing an inconvenient truth. "The town council approved bridge repairs for spring. We don't have budget to..." "Budget isn't the issue. The bracket is the issue. I'll fix it for the cost of materials if someone will authorize me to do the work. A day's job, maybe a day and a half. But it needs to happen soon." Pruitt looked at him with the expression of a man performing a calculation that involved trouble on one side and trouble on the other. "I'll bring it to the council," he said. The council met once a month. They had met 6 days ago. "When's the next meeting?" Rowan asked. "Third week of December." Rowan looked at the sheriff for a moment. Then he said, "All right," and left, and stood outside on the boardwalk in the cold wind, looking south toward where the bridge sat invisible beyond the edge of town. And he thought about the crack in the bracket, and the softness in the planks, and the rain that was supposed to come in again this weekend. He thought about going ahead and fixing it himself, without authorization, at his own cost. It wasn't the first time he'd considered it. He'd done it before. Small things, roadside things. A fence post near the schoolhouse that was leaning into the footpath. A drainage culvert near the creek that was backing up and turning the road muddy. But the bridge was different. It wasn't a fence post. The bracket alone would cost him close to what he made in a week, and the materials for the plank repair would add to that, and he was already running thin from a slow October. He went back to the smithy. He told himself the council would act quickly when he brought it through proper channels. He told himself Pruitt wasn't a bad man, just a careful one. He told himself the rain might hold off. It was Eliza who noticed the toys. Rowan had been making them since October. Small iron figures, horses and dogs, and one very specific horse that was clearly meant for a child who dreamed of ranches. He made them in the hours before dawn from scraps of iron too small for other jobs, working by the light of the forge. It wasn't something he'd decided to do formally. It had started with a half-hour one morning when he'd looked at a curl of leftover iron and seen, for no reason he could explain, the shape of a horse in it. He left them in places where children would find them. By the schoolhouse steps, on top of the fence post near the Garrett house where Thomas always sat, tucked on a window ledge at the Mercantile where families came in on Saturdays. He never watched to see who found them. Eliza mentioned it one afternoon when she came to pick up a bracket she'd asked him to make for a new shelf in the schoolroom. She was looking at the work table where 3 unfinished figures were waiting for final shaping. She couldn't have known they were toys yet. They were still rough, but she looked at them carefully. "What are those?" she asked. "Nothing yet," he said. "Scrapwork." She looked at them another moment. Then she looked at him, and something in her expression was different from its usual composed interest. Softer, or maybe just more direct. "I found a horse on the front steps of the schoolhouse 2 weeks ago," she said. "Small iron one, beautifully made." Rowan said nothing. "Bobby Marsh has been carrying it in his pocket every day since," she said. "He told the other children a mysterious ironworker left it, which I think is the most romantic thing a 7-year-old has ever said." "He'd probably like any horse figure," Rowan said. "The other children found one each too, over the following week." She was watching him. "On the fence post and on the Mercantile window." "Sounds like someone has a lot of scrap iron," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, deliberately, she didn't press it further, just picked up her bracket and said it was exactly what she'd hoped for, and thanked him and said she'd see him around. At the door she stopped, which she did sometimes, and turned back. "Mr. Hale." "Miss Rowan." "Whoever makes those toys," she said, "is doing something that matters, more than they probably know." Then she left, and Rowan stood in the heat of the forge and stared at the wall for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before getting back to work. The rain returned on a Wednesday. Not the thin November rain they'd had before, but the real kind. Driven, heavy, arriving before dawn and not relenting. By midday the creek had risen 8 inches. By nightfall it was over the bank on the south side, moving into the lower fields with a slow, unconvinced authority. Rowan stood at the edge of the forge's open side door and watched the rain hit the dirt of the yard, turning it dark and then darker. He was thinking about the bracket. He was thinking about the bracket when Colt Mercer ducked through the side door with water streaming off his hat brim and said, in his easy, unworried way, "Creek's high." "I know," Rowan said. "Think the bridge will hold?" Rowan looked at him. "No," he said. "Not if this keeps up." Colt absorbed this with that particular rancher's practicality that Rowan had always respected in him. "You told Pruitt?" "Twice." "He do anything?" Council meets third week of December. Colt muttered something short and to the point, then pushed his hat back and looked at the rain. "Who uses that bridge regular?" he asked. "Everybody going to the South Range, Harmon, Henderson, the cattle drovers when they're running." Rowan paused. "Doc Henshaw crosses it to get to the Blaine homestead, where that family's been down sick." "That's not great." "No." They stood in the doorway for a while, both of them looking at rain. "I talked to Eliza this week," Colt said, and his tone had shifted into something more careful, which Rowan recognized as the tone Colt used when he was navigating uncertain ground. "All right," Rowan said. "She's interesting. Genuinely interesting, which is rarer than you'd think." A pause. "She mentioned you." Rowan kept looking at the rain. "Did she?" "Said you were the most useful person in Dry Mesa." Meant it as a compliment from the way she said it. Colt looked at him sideways. "You know she comes by here sometimes, just to, I don't know, watch you work, I think. She told me she finds it interesting how you always look for the real problem instead of the obvious one." Rowan didn't say anything. "Rowan," Colt said, "I'm listening." "She's not looking at you the way she looks at someone whose hinge she needs fixed." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. The rain hammered the yard. The forge breathed behind them. "Colt," he said finally, "you're a good man and a better option than anything I am." "That's a genuinely strange thing to say about yourself." "I've got scars on my hands and a 2-room house, and debts I'm still paying off from when the shop changed over. She came from Philadelphia. She deserves—" "Rowan." Colt's voice was patient but not gentle. "She's not a horse you're trying to match with the right paddock. She's a person who makes her own decisions." "I know that." "Does she know you think she'd be better off without you?" Rowan didn't answer. Colt shook his head slowly and put his hat back on. "I'm going to check the bridge before dark," he said. "You should come." "I'll follow in an hour," Rowan said. "Let me bank the fire." Colt nodded and went back out into the rain, and Rowan turned to the forge and spent a moment staring into the coals, that deep, patient orange glow that never asked anything of him, that just burned, before reaching for the damper. The rain outside wasn't stopping. The bridge, he knew, was waiting. He lay awake that night, listening to the rain on the roof of his small house, and he thought about what Colt had said, not the part about Eliza, which was the part his mind wanted to circle back to, and the part he kept deliberately redirecting away from, but the earlier part, the part about looking for the real problem instead of the obvious one. He'd never thought of it as a skill. It was just the way he saw things. A broken hinge told you a story if you looked at it correctly. The shear pattern, the wear, the angle of the break. They told you how the failure happened, how long it had been building, what the real weakness was, not just the surface one. It was the same with a wagon axle, the same with a plow blade, the same with a bridge bracket that half the town was choosing not to see. She finds it interesting how you always look for the real problem instead of the obvious one. He turned on his side and looked at the dark wall of his house, the one with the single window that showed a narrow strip of rain-wet night sky. He thought about a woman who asked about fires that burned before dawn, who paid 25 cents for a 20-cent job without letting him argue about it, who had tracked down a hidden crate of books from a description that amounted to nothing more than the mention that they existed. He told himself this was not the time to be thinking about any of this. He had a bridge to worry about. He had a business that needed to survive the winter. He had the Henderson account still partially unpaid, and the materials cost for a job next week he hadn't fully accounted for. He had the crack in the bracket, the softness in the planks, the creek 8 inches over its bank and rising. The rain kept coming. He closed his eyes and eventually, in the way exhausted men eventually sleep even when their minds are arguing against it, went under. He had no way of knowing that in 4 days, everything he'd been unable to say, everything the town had failed to see, and everything the bridge had been quietly warning them about, would all come together in the brutal, freezing water below the old crossing and force an answer out of him whether he was ready for one or not. But that was 4 days away. Tonight, there was just the rain, and the fire, banked low in the forge next door, holding its heat against the cold, waiting, the way it always waited, for morning. Boss. End of part 1. Part 2 lưu ý. Viết 3.000 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sảng, có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đàn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu, lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dựng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh, không mở rộng nội dung. Show more part 2. The weight of being invisible. The rain quit by Thursday morning, leaving behind the kind of silence that felt provisional. The sky still low and gray, the ground saturated, the creek running fast and brown and 3 feet higher than it had any business being in November. Rowan crossed the south road before dawn to look at the bridge again, standing at the edge of it with a lantern, watching the water move underneath. It was holding. For now. The eastern bracket, the cracked one, the one he'd told Pruitt about twice, was flexing visibly when the current pushed against the nearest piling. He could see it in the lantern light, that faint, terrible movement where there should have been stillness. The bolts were working against the wood now, slowly, but working. He stood there for a while, doing the math in his head. Not the money math, the structural math, the way force distributes through a weakened joint, the way a fracture that takes months to form can let go in seconds when the conditions finally line up against it. Then he walked back to the smithy and started his fire. He pulled out his ledger that morning, which was a battered thing he kept in the drawer with the important papers, including Eliza's unsigned note about his hands. He went through the numbers with the same deliberate care he brought to every technical problem. The bracket repair would run him close to $4 in materials. Iron stock, new bolts, the bracket plate itself, which he'd need to fabricate fresh because the existing one was too far gone to rebuild. $4 was not nothing. $4 was 3 days of normal work, and he had 2 weeks of jobs already promised that would leave him thin going into December. He sat with that for a while. Then he wrote the materials list, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. Some things you waited for permission to do. Some things you just did. He sent Thomas Garrett, who appeared as reliably as the sunrise whenever there was a message to carry, drawn by the prospect of a penny, to Pruitt's office with a note that said simply, "I'm going to fix the eastern bracket on the bridge this Saturday, at my cost. Thought you should know." He didn't ask. He wasn't looking for the council's blessing anymore. He was just being courteous about it, the same way you'd tell a neighbor you were trimming the tree that hung over both your yards. Pruitt didn't send a response. Rowan took that as acknowledgement. He ordered the materials from Dawson's on Friday morning, and May Dawson, who missed very little, looked at the list and then looked at him. "Bridge work?" she said. "Bracket repair." "Town paying for this?" "Town's busy," he said. May wrote up the order without further comment, but when he came back in the afternoon to collect the iron stock, she had added a half-pound of extra rivets to the bundle and charged him for none of it. When he pointed it out, she said she didn't know what he was talking about and went to the back room, and he decided to leave it alone. The work itself took most of Saturday. He went out at first light, when the road was empty, and spent the morning disassembling what he could of the eastern support. Carefully, because the whole structure was sensitive right now, and a careless move could accelerate exactly what he was trying to prevent. He worked alone, in the cold, with the creek running loud and brown 6 feet below him, and it was uncomfortable and slow, and nothing about it was clean or easy. By noon, he had the cracked bracket off and the new one roughed into shape. He ate a cold biscuit from his coat pocket without sitting down. By mid-afternoon, the new bracket was in, the bolts torqued properly, and he was doing the plank work, pulling the soft sections, cutting new stock to length, setting them with a precision that meant they'd carry weight evenly rather than concentrating stress on the edges. He was driving the last nail when he heard hoofbeats on the road. Colt pulled up and looked down from his horse with the expression of a man who was unsurprised but mildly amused. "You're actually doing it," Colt said. "Told Pruitt I would." "In the note that you sent him without asking if it was all right?" "I informed him," Rowan said. "That's different." Colt swung down from the saddle and crouched at the edge of the bridge, looking at the new bracket work with a practiced eye. He knew enough about structures from years of ranch building to read what he was seeing. "That's solid work," he said. "It should have been done 6 weeks ago." "Yeah." Colt stood up. "I talked to Pruitt yesterday. He said to tell you the council would reimburse you for materials." Rowan drove the last nail. "I'll believe it when it happens." "You don't have to be like this about it." "Like what?" "Like someone who's decided ahead of time that he won't be helped." Colt looked at him levelly. "Not everyone who says they'll do something fails to do it." Rowan was quiet because there was truth in it, and he knew it, and arguing with truth was something he generally tried not to waste time on. He gathered his tools. "How's the South Road looking?" he asked. "Muddy but passable," Colt said. "Creek should go down in the next few days if the rain holds off." He paused. "Eliza's been asking about you." The tool bag stopped moving for just a moment. "She's been asking about me how?" Rowan said. Colt had the self-possession to answer it straight rather than make something of it. "She asked May Dawson whether you were all right. Apparently May told her you'd been working double hours this week and hadn't been eating at the diner, which May had no business knowing, but there it is." "I eat at home. I know that. May knows that. Eliza was just asking because she—" Colt paused. "She pays attention to things. People, mostly. She pays attention to people in the way that makes you realize most of us walk around not being paid attention to at all." Rowan shouldered the tool bag. "She's a good person," he said. "You should—" "Don't," Colt said. "Don't what?" "Don't finish that sentence the way you're about to finish it." Colt's voice wasn't harsh. It was the voice of a man who was tired of watching something happen in slow motion. "You were about to tell me to pursue her, like you're a horse trader offering me first look at the stock." "I wasn't, Ipan." "Rowan." Colt looked at him with something that was almost impatience, except warmer. "She asked about you, not about me. She already knows where I am. I'm the man everyone can see. She's asking about the one they can't." The wind came off the plains, flat and cold, and pulled at the collar of Rowan's coat. Down in the creek, the brown water moved fast, carrying debris from somewhere upstream. A branch, a tangle of dead grass, things that had been dislodged by the rain and were now being carried somewhere they hadn't intended to go. "It doesn't change anything," Rowan said. Colt looked at him for a long moment, and for once he didn't argue back. He just picked up his reins and said, "I know you think that," and rode back toward town. Rowan stood on the repaired bridge alone and tested his weight against the planks, and they held the way things hold when they've been properly fixed. Without complaint, without flex, just solid and quiet and ready for the load. He walked back to the smithy in the gathering dark. The week that followed had its own texture, its own small accumulation of moments that he would not have described to anyone, but that had a weight to them, the way ordinary days sometimes do when something is shifting beneath their surface. Eliza came by the smithy on a Tuesday, not with a job or a repair request, but on what she called a walking errand that took her past his door, which was a polite fiction they both understood. She stood at the open doorway while he worked, watching without speaking much, and he found that he didn't mind it the way he'd expected to mind it. Most people who watched him work made him self-conscious, aware of being observed. She somehow didn't. She watched the way you watch a fire, not because you're judging it, but because something about it steadies you. "What are you making?" she asked. "Hinges," he said. 12 of them for the new courthouse annex. "They all look the same." "They have to look the same, otherwise they hang wrong." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you ever make things just because you want to? Not because someone ordered them?" He kept his eyes on the work. Sometimes. The horses. He didn't answer directly. Some things, he said. What else? The question was genuine. She wasn't probing for something hidden. She was just asking, the way she asked most things, as if the answer actually mattered. When my old teacher was dying, Rowan said, and he was surprised to hear himself saying it, he couldn't get warm. The stove in his room was falling apart. Old thing, cracked firebox, barely drew. I rebuilt it. Not a repair job, a full rebuild, over 2 nights. I didn't have the materials, so I bought them and ate thin for a month afterward. He set down the hammer for a moment. He was warm his last 6 weeks. He never knew who fixed it. He thought the landlady had arranged it. Eliza said nothing for a moment. Did that bother you? She asked. Him not knowing? No, he said. And then, more honestly, a little. Not for my sake, because I would have liked to tell him I'd learned enough from him to do it right. But that was for me, not him. You wanted him to know you'd been paying attention. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. Something like that. She held his gaze for a moment, and there was something in her expression, not pity, which he would have resented, and not admiration exactly, which he always found uncomfortable, something that was more like recognition, like she was seeing something she'd suspected was there. Then she said she had to get back to the schoolhouse before the afternoon session, and she left, and Rowan went back to his hinges. He made 12 of them, and they were all exactly the same, and none of them gave him any satisfaction at all. The children began to notice things. This was the quiet consequence of the iron toys. Word had spread, the way word spreads in a town with 400 people, and nothing competing with it for attention. And now the children of Dry Mesa had collectively decided that something interesting was happening, which meant they paid attention. Bobby Marsh, who had carried his iron horse in his pocket every day since finding it on the schoolhouse steps, appointed himself something between investigator and advocate. He visited the smithy on a Wednesday after school, ostensibly with a message from his mother about a cooking pot handle. But he lingered after delivering it and looked around the shop with the focused intensity of a 7-year-old who believes he is being subtle. Are you the one who made my horse? Bobby asked. Rowan was cleaning a file. What horse is that? Bobby clearly believed this was neither a denial nor a confirmation, and therefore promising. The iron one. From the steps. It looks like a real horse. The legs are right. He paused. I checked against a picture in Miss Rowan's book. Miss Rowan let you use her book? She said I could look at the horse pictures if I did my arithmetic. He studied Rowan with serious brown eyes. You can just tell me if it was you. I'm not going to tell anyone. Your mother's pot handle needs a new pin, Rowan said. Tell her it'll be ready Friday. Bobby looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the dignity of a 7-year-old closing a negotiation, Thank you for the horse. He left, and Rowan stood in the smithy and felt the particular inconvenient warmth of being seen by someone too young to have learned yet that seeing people is supposed to be complicated. Colt and Eliza were seen together 3 times that week. At the diner on Monday, at May Dawson's store on Wednesday, walking the main drag on Friday evening while the early dark of late November settled over the street. The town watched all of this with the comfortable satisfaction of a community that believes it knows how a story is supposed to go. Rowan heard about it the way he heard about everything. Fragments, May's commentary, Thomas Garrett's casual reporting, the natural accumulation of information that moved through a small town like weather. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself it was the right arrangement. He told himself all the things he'd been telling himself for weeks, and they sat in him with the same dull weight they always had, unpersuasive but persistent. On Friday evening, he was working late, a job that needed to be done by morning, a set of gate hinges for the Harmon ranch that Harmon himself was coming to collect at sunup, when he heard footsteps on the boards outside, and Eliza appeared in the doorway. She had her dark blue coat on, and her hair was slightly windblown, and she looked like she'd been walking in the cold and hadn't minded it. Working late, she said. Have to be done by morning. She came inside, which she did now with a comfort that had built up gradually over the weeks without either of them making a point of it. She stood near the forge, where the heat was, and pulled her coat a little tighter. I saw you from the road, she said. The light. It's visible at night. It is. She looked at the fire for a moment. I was walking back from the diner. I had dinner with Colt. He kept his eyes on the work. I heard. He's good company, she said. He makes things easy. Conversation, decisions, everything. A pause that had something careful in it. Some men are like that. The air around them is easy to breathe. Colt's a good man, Rowan said. He is. She turned from the forge and looked at him directly. He also spent most of dinner talking about you. That made him look up. Not conspicuously, she said. He wasn't making a point of it, but he mentioned things. The bridge repair. That you did it at your own cost, on your own time, without being asked. The stoves you fixed for families who couldn't pay for them. The fact that you sent food to the Blaine homestead when they were sick, anonymously, through May Dawson. She paused. Was that anonymous? May Dawson, Rowan said, with a specific exhaustion, talks too much. She talks the right amount, Eliza said quietly. To the right people. He set the hinge down on the bench. He hadn't meant to stop working, but his hands had made the decision without consulting him. What do you want me to say to that? He asked. Nothing, she said. I'm not asking you to account for anything. She looked at him, and in the light of the forge, her expression was direct and a little tired in the way of someone who has thought something through many times and is now saying it plainly. I'm asking you to stop deciding for me. He didn't follow, and it showed on his face. You've been managing things, she said, arranging the view so that what I see is Colt and what I don't see is you. Telling him you think he's the better option, which he mentioned to me, yes, so you know. Disappearing every time there's a social event. Being useful and invisible at the same time. And I think you believe that if you stay invisible long enough, the question of what I want stops being your problem. He was quiet for a long time. The fire breathed. Outside, the cold sat on the town like a held breath. I've got nothing to offer you, he said, and it came out more plainly than he'd intended. Not a speech, just a fact as he understood it. I've got a 2-room house and debts and hands that look like a topographical map of bad decisions. You came from Philadelphia, you've been educated, you could go anywhere, do anything. He stopped, started again. A woman like you doesn't end up with the man who fixes things. She ends up with the man worth fixing things for. And that's Colt. That's always going to be Colt. Eliza looked at him for what felt like a long time. You fix things, she said slowly, because you see what other people miss. That's not a trade. That's not a job. That's who you are. She picked up her coat lapels, a small preparatory movement, as if she was steadying herself for the cold outside. And you just decided, entirely on your own, what kind of man I'm capable of valuing, without asking me. She walked to the door. That hinge I brought you, she said, pausing at the threshold. The broken one, my first week. You took one look at it and told me exactly what had failed and how long it had been failing and what the real problem was underneath the obvious one. She turned back and met his eyes. You do that with everything. Every broken thing that comes through that door. A beat. Except yourself. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading on the boards, and Rowan stood in the heat and the orange light and the sound of the fire, and he put his hands flat on the workbench and looked at the scars on them. The thin silver lines, the thickened skin at the base of his thumb, the small, perfect circle of an old burn near his right wrist that he'd had so long he'd stopped seeing it. He stood there like that for a while. Then he picked up the hinge and the hammer and went back to work. He didn't sleep well that night. The gate hinges were done and stacked for Harmon, and the fire was banked and the house was quiet, and he lay in the dark with Eliza's words moving through him in the slow, unavoidable way of things that are true and that you can't unfeel once they've landed. You do that with everything, except yourself. He'd built a story about himself. He knew that now, lying there with the cold pressing at the window glass. He'd built it from real materials, the poverty, the scars, the dead teacher, the shop that had come to him by accident rather than ambition, but he'd built it into something more fixed than it needed to be. A structure. A bracket, he thought, and then almost laughed at himself for thinking in bridges. A bracket he'd decided was the load-bearing element, the thing that had to hold so everything else could function, and he'd never once looked at whether the fracture in it was real or whether he'd just been staring at the crack so long he'd stopped seeing the metal that was still whole. The cold outside moved against the house. Far away, the creek ran on, quieter now that the water had begun to recede, but still present, still carrying its weight toward wherever it was going. He thought about the iron horse in Bobby Marsh's pocket. He thought about the forge that had been burning before he got to it in the morning and would be waiting when he arrived. He thought about the gloves in the drawer and the unsigned note and the way Eliza Rowan had stood in his doorway and watched him work without making him feel like something being evaluated. He thought about what it would cost to stop deciding for her. He didn't have an answer for that yet. But for the first time in a long time, the question felt like something he was allowed to ask. He closed his eyes. Outside, the first light was still hours away, but somewhere beyond the window the darkness was the particular shade it turns in the hour before anything begins. Not quite night anymore. Not yet morning. That suspended moment when the world holds its breath and whatever comes next is still undecided. The forge was waiting, banked low, holding its heat against the cold. Rowan slept. Part bạn lưu ý. Viết 3.000 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hồi thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chỉ đàn bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu, lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu, hãy viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show more. Part 3. The river decides. The days between that Friday night and what happened at the bridge were not dramatic days. That was the thing nobody would have predicted, that the world before a crisis looked so ordinary. Rowan woke each morning, built his fire, worked his jobs. He delivered the gate hinges to Harmon before sunup on Saturday, and Harmon grunted something that might have been thanks and handed over payment in coins that Rowan counted later and found short by 40 cents, which was standard for Harmon and not worth the conversation. He and Eliza did not speak directly for 5 days after the night at the forge. Not from avoidance exactly, or not only from avoidance. She had said what she'd come to say, and he suspected she was giving him room to do something with it, which was either generous or patient or both. He wasn't sure he deserved either. He thought about her words at inconvenient times. Midway through shoeing a horse, the animal's hoof between his knees and the nail set between his fingers, he'd find himself back in the forge doorway. Hearing her voice say, "Accept yourself," and he'd have to physically redirect his attention back to the hoof, because a misset nail in a horse's foot was not something you fixed with an apology. The creek continued dropping. By Tuesday, it was back within its banks, carrying less debris, the brown beginning to clear at the edges. Rowan walked the bridge again that morning and found his repair work holding cleanly, the new bracket solid, the planks tight, no flex in the structure where there shouldn't be any. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction about that and then moved on. What he did not know, what nobody in Dry Mesa knew yet, was that 6 miles upstream, where the creek bent around the base of a limestone shelf, 2 days of sustained water pressure had been quietly undermining the base of a natural dam that had been there so long nobody thought of it as a dam anymore. Just a rocky ledge, a place where the water narrowed. The rain had found the weakness in it, the way water always finds weakness, with that particular patient violence that has no malice but no mercy either. On the morning of December 19th, 6 days before Christmas, it let go. Rowan was at the forge when he heard it, or rather, felt it first, a low vibration through the floor of the smithy that he registered before he understood what it was. Then the sound arrived, a deep, sustained roar from the south that didn't stop, didn't have the shape of thunder, just kept building and building until the horses in the livery 2 doors down started screaming. He was out the door before he'd made a conscious decision to move. The street was filling with people. All of them turned south, all of them wearing the expression of people trying to calibrate something they'd never experienced before. The roar was louder now, fuller, and underneath it was a new sound, the tearing, cracking protest of things being broken by force. "Creek!" somebody shouted. "Creek's flooding! The South Road!" Rowan was already running. He grabbed his tool bag from just inside the smithy door on instinct, not thinking about why, just knowing the way his hands knew things, and ran the half-mile to the bridge at a pace that burned his lungs in the cold air. He heard Colt's voice somewhere behind him, other boots on the road, the general chaos of a town mobilizing without a plan. What he saw when he reached the South Road stopped him for a 3-second count that felt much longer. The creek was not a creek anymore. It was 30 feet across where it had been 10, dark and violent, carrying tree limbs and fence posts and things he couldn't identify in the churn of it. The water had come over the south bank and was spreading into the lower road in a slow brown sheet that was still moving, still rising. And on the bridge, or what remained accessible of the bridge, a freight wagon had stopped. Or been stopped. Old Pete Calloway, who ran provisions between Dry Mesa and the outlying homesteads, had been crossing when the surge came, and now his wagon sat at an angle on the bridge. One rear wheel dropped through a section of planking that had given way under the water's pressure. His horse, a big gray draft animal, 17 hands at least, was chest deep in water on the downstream side, legs churning, wild-eyed, the harness line still connecting it to the wagon that was half-pinning it against the bridge railing. Pete himself was clinging to the wagon seat, one arm wrapped around the brake handle, a man in his 70s who looked very small against the size of what was happening around him. People were arriving behind Rowan now. He could hear Colt's voice, sharp and organizing. "Get a rope! Somebody get a long rope!" And the crowd was at the bank, 15 feet from the bridge approach. Nobody going further because the planking between the bank and the wagon looked uncertain, and the water below it was not water you survived falling into unprepared. Colt didn't hesitate. That was the true thing about him, the thing Rowan had always respected without envy. Colt moved toward danger with a natural physical confidence that wasn't recklessness, just the body of a man who had never had serious reason to doubt what his body could do. He took the rope someone threw him and went for the horse, which was the obvious problem, the screaming, visible problem that every instinct pointed toward. Rowan stood at the bank for exactly the time it took him to read the situation. The horse was panicking, yes, but the horse wasn't the thing keeping Pete Calloway on that bridge. The wagon was still connected to the harness, and the wagon was pinned, not by the dropped wheel alone, but by something under the water on the downstream side. He could see it in the angle of the wagon, the way it listed wrong, the fact that it hadn't moved despite the current pushing against it. Something was holding it, something metal probably, debris from the surge, or a piece of the railing that had folded under, or one of the old iron supports from the bridge's understructure that the water had knocked loose. He could also see, and this was the part that moved his feet, that the plank section Pete's wagon had broken through was directly over the main support beam. The beam was taking the full force of the current now, and the new bracket he'd installed was holding, but the beam itself was old, and there was a secondary crack running along its upper face that he'd noted 3 weeks ago and flagged for spring repair, and that now, under this load, was opening. If the beam went, the whole eastern span went. Pete went. The horse went. Colt, who was currently in the water to his waist, went. Rowan went down the bank. The cold hit him like a door. Not gradually, all at once, a full-body shock that tried to convince his lungs that breathing was optional. The water at the bank edge was thigh-deep and moving faster than it looked from above. He planted his feet wide and leaned into the current and moved along the underside of the bridge, one hand on the structure above him, the other holding the tool bag across his chest. He heard Eliza's voice from the bank. He recognized it, without seeing her, the particular timbre of it, saying something sharp that he couldn't make out over the noise of the water. Under the bridge, out of the worst of the current, he could see the problem clearly. A section of the old iron undercarriage, one of the cross members that he'd flagged as marginal but not critical, had been knocked loose by the surge and was now jammed at a 40-degree angle against the downstream face of the main beam, acting as a wedge. The wagon's rear axle had come to rest against this wedge from above, which was why the wagon wasn't moving. Every time the current pushed the wagon, it drove the wedge harder against the beam. The beam's crack was now 3 inches wide at its widest point. He had maybe 15 minutes before it failed, possibly less. "Colt!" He had to shout it twice before Colt's head appeared over the edge of the bridge. "Stop pulling on the horse. Every time you pull the horse, you push the wagon into the beam. Leave the horse, get Pete off the wagon first." Colt's expression said he didn't fully understand the reasoning, but had enough trust to act on it. "Pete won't let go of the brake." "Tell him the wagon's going in the water regardless, and he needs to choose whether he goes with it." A pause. Then Colt's voice, louder, talking to Pete, and Pete's voice back, thin and frightened and stubborn, the way old men get stubborn when they're scared. Rowan opened the tool bag, which was wet through, but had kept the tools dry enough. He had a cold chisel, a short-handled hammer, a bolt cutter he'd thrown in on instinct, and a pry bar. He looked at the wedged cross member and did the calculation that you only have time to do once. The noise down here was extraordinary. The water hit the pilings and the underside of the planking and bounced back on itself in a constant, chaotic percussion, and under all of that was the deeper sound of the beam, that low structural groan that materials make when they're being asked to do more than they were built for. He set the cold chisel at the base of the wedge where it contacted the beam. The angle was bad. He was working with the current pushing against his back, 1 foot on a submerged timber that might or might not hold his weight. And the first strike of the hammer was off, glancing, the chisel skittering sideways. He reset it. Second strike better. Third strike, and he felt the crossmember shift, just slightly, just enough to know the approach was right. Above him, he heard Colt's voice, then a scuffling, then Pete's voice saying something that might have been a profanity or a prayer and was probably both. There was movement in the wagon. He could feel it transmitted through the structure. And then a sound that was Pete Calloway finally, reluctantly, letting go of the brake handle and accepting Colt's arm over the railing. The wagon, relieved of Pete's weight on the upstream side, shifted, which drove the wedge into the beam with a force that sent a visible shudder through the whole span and knocked Rowan sideways into the current. The cold water took him to his shoulder before he got his hand around the piling and stopped the slide. The tool bag swung on its strap across his chest. He pulled himself back, coughing, and found his footing again on the submerged timber and picked up the hammer that was, improbably, still in his hand. The beam was making a sound now that he didn't like, a higher frequency crack under the groaning, the sound a piece of timber makes in the last stages before it gives. He had stopped counting minutes. He had one job. He hit the chisel 5 more times in rapid succession, the strikes not clean, but each one carrying everything he had. And on the 5th, the crossmember broke free of its wedge position and swung downstream and was gone in the current. The relief of force on the beam was immediate. He could feel it. The groaning dropped a register. The shuddering in the structure stilled. Not fixed. The crack was still there. The beam was still compromised, but the immediate catastrophic failure had stepped back from the edge of the next minute and moved to the edge of the next hour, which was enough. He heard the horse moving, not the panicked churning from before, but purposeful movement, the big draft animal finding its footing and beginning to pull toward the bank, which it would do on its own now that the harness tension had changed with the wagon's shift. Rowan moved back along the underside of the bridge toward the bank, hand over hand on the structure above, and when the water got shallow enough to stand properly, he stood, and the cold hit him all over again because he'd forgotten, in the work of the last however many minutes, that he was soaked to the chest in December Creek water. He came up the bank and there were people, more people than he'd registered arriving, a crowd, the kind of crowd a crisis assembles without sending invitations. Someone put a blanket over his shoulders, which he hadn't asked for, and he stood there in it and breathed for a moment. Colt was on the bank with Pete Calloway, the old man seated on the ground with another blanket, his face gray and his hands shaking but alive, coherent, already beginning to reorient toward anger about the wagon, which was still on the bridge. The gray draft horse had made it to the bank 20 yards downstream and was standing in the shallows, head down, sides heaving, the harness hanging loose and trailing in the water. Alive. "Is it going to hold?" Colt asked him, coming over, meaning the bridge. "The span?" "For now. The beam needs proper repair before any loaded traffic crosses." Rowan was still catching his breath. Weeks of work. Real work. Not an afternoon job. All right. Colt nodded once, processing, then looked at him. You could have told me the plan before you went under there. There wasn't time. There was 30 seconds. I spent those 30 seconds getting in the water. Colt looked at him for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, You knew that beam was going. I thought it might. That's not the same thing as thought, Rowan. You knew. He didn't argue it because it was true and they both knew it. He'd gone under a structure he believed was in its last minutes of integrity, in December water, because the math had said it was the only way to change the outcome, and there wasn't anyone else who knew how to read the math. The crowd was doing what crowds do after crisis. The energy that had no outlet turning toward noise, voices overlapping, Pete being helped to his feet, questions being asked and half answered. Someone had thought to bring dry coats from somewhere. Sheriff Pruitt arrived, which was perhaps 10 minutes after everything that needed doing had been done, and began organizing things with the authority of a man who is most comfortable with a situation once it has already resolved itself. Rowan stood at the edge of it. The blanket was doing something for the cold, not enough, and his hands had gone from numb to the painful stage that comes after numb, which meant circulation returning, which was a good sign medically and an unpleasant experience personally. There were cuts on both palms. The chisel work in moving water wasn't precise, and his right wrist had a fresh burn from where a bolt had heated during the impact work, which was a thing that happened when you hit hot metal with enough force in the wrong conditions. He became aware that Eliza was standing beside him. He didn't know when she'd arrived at his shoulder. She was there the way she'd been there at the forge doorway, present, quiet, not requiring anything from him. She looked at his hands. He looked at his hands too, because it gave him something to focus on other than her face, which he was finding difficult to look at directly right now for reasons that had less to do with cold and more to do with what Colt had said, and what she had said, and what he had not yet found the words to say back. The palm, she said. That needs to be cleaned. I know. Doc Henshaw's on the main road. I know where Doc Henshaw is. She was quiet a moment. You went under there, she said, and her voice had something in it that he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't what he'd expected, wasn't the bright relief of someone whose fear had resolved. It was more complicated than that. More like someone who has watched a thing happen that clarified something they already knew but hadn't wanted to know quite so plainly. Had to, he said. I know. Another pause. The horse. Everyone was looking at the horse. Colt was going for the horse. That was the obvious problem. The horse wasn't the problem, he said. I know, she said, for the third time, and now he heard it. What was in her voice? It wasn't surprise. It wasn't even relief. It was the sound of something already decided, confirmed, like a bracket that had been set correctly and was simply doing what it was built to do. He finally looked at her. Her face was pale from the cold and her eyes were steady on his. And she was not the sort of person whose expression performed what she felt, which meant that what he was seeing was what was actually there. A directness that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with someone who had been paying attention for 6 weeks and had now seen all the evidence she needed. Rowan, she said. Yeah. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. Around them the crowd moved and the creek ran, and Pete Calloway was arguing with Pruitt about salvaging the wagon, and Colt was organizing the horse, and the world was doing all the things the world does when a crisis has passed but hasn't quite finished making its point. The two of them stood at the bank in the cold. His hands hurt. His shoulder hurt where the current had slammed him into the piling. The blanket was doing its inadequate best against the December air. He was probably going to feel this tomorrow in ways he hadn't fully inventoried yet. None of that was the thing he was thinking about. He was thinking about a woman who had stood in his doorway for 6 weeks and watched a fire that burned before anyone else in town was awake, and who had bought him 25 cents worth of hinge repair and $5 worth of attention, and who had left a note unsigned because she'd understood, without being told, that he'd accept it better that way. He was thinking about how exhausting it was, the story he'd built about himself, how much work it took to maintain it, how it had been crumbling, he realized now, since the first Friday she'd come to the smithy with a broken hinge and stayed to ask about the fire. He looked at his hands again, the cuts, the old burn scars, the calluses. The particular geography of years of work that had never asked to be beautiful and wasn't. Then he looked at the creek, which was still high and still violent and had nearly taken something irreplaceable today. He understood something then, standing on that bank. Not an idea, exactly. More like a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be permanent. The weight of the story. The bracket he'd put around himself that said, not enough, never going to be enough. It wasn't a fact. It was a thing he'd built. And he was, when everything was stripped back to its foundation, a man who knew how to take apart the things that were broken and rebuild them correctly. He had not yet done that for himself. He hadn't been ready before. He thought, standing in the cold with his cut hands and his wet clothes, and the sound of the creek receding behind him, that he might be getting there. The crowd was thinning. Pruitt had the situation in hand, which was another way of saying the situation had handled itself, and Pruitt was now taking custody of it. Colt caught Rowan's eye from 20 yards away and gave him a long, steady look that communicated several things without words, the way old acquaintance sometimes does. Rowan gave him a small nod back. Colt looked at Eliza, then back at Rowan, and then he turned and walked toward Pete Calloway and the business of managing the aftermath, and his back, as he walked away, had the particular quality of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "Come on," Eliza said, and she was looking at his hands again. "Doc Henshaw." "I'm all right." "Your palm is bleeding on the blanket." He looked down. It was. "Doc Henshaw," he said. "That's what I said." They walked up the road together, away from the bank, away from the broken bridge and the surviving horse and the gathered watchers who were already beginning to talk about what they'd seen, assembling the story, deciding what it meant. The cold sat on everything, patient and indifferent. But the forge, a half-mile north, was still burning, banked low, holding its heat the way it always held through the night. It would be there when he got back. Part 4 lưu ý, viết 3.000 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chỉ đàn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh, không mở rộng nội dung. Show more. Part 4. The Courage to Believe. Doc Henshaw's office smelled like camphor and wood smoke, and the particular staleness of a room that was cleaned regularly but never quite aired out. It was a small space, 2 chairs, an examination table with the leather surface cracked from years of use, shelves of brown medicine bottles arranged with a precision that suggested a man who needed order around him because his work rarely provided it. Henshaw was 61, a compact man with a white beard trimmed close, and the steady hands of someone who had long ago made peace with what his profession asked of him. He cleaned Rowan's palms without commentary, which Rowan appreciated, and stitched the deeper cut on the left hand with the efficient disinterest of a man for whom stitching was as unremarkable as hammering was to Rowan. Eliza sat in the second chair and did not look away, which surprised him a little. Most people found the needlework difficult to watch. "You've had worse than this," Henshaw said, not as a question. "Yes," Rowan said. "The wrist burn is superficial. Keep it clean. It'll be gone in 2 weeks." Henshaw wrapped the palm with cloth bandaging, firm and neat. "The stitches need to stay in 10 days. No heavy forge work with this hand until the 5th day at least, or you'll pull them. I have jobs." I know you have jobs. I said the fifth day, not never. Henshaw looked at him over the rim of his glasses. You also went into December Creek water for what I'm told was close to 20 minutes. You feel cold anywhere that isn't coming back? Feet were slow. They're back now. Keep them warm tonight. If you wake up and can't feel your toes, come get me regardless of the hour. He handed Rowan a small cloth packet. Willow bark. For the shoulder. Rowan hadn't mentioned the shoulder. Your right side's been hitching since you walked in, Henshaw said. Don't tell me it's nothing. It's not nothing, Rowan admitted. Current took me into a piling. Ribs intact by the way you're breathing, so something softer. Muscle, probably. It'll hurt for a week. He stepped back. Anything else you neglected to mention? No. All right. Henshaw looked at Eliza, then back at Rowan, with the expression of a man who observed things professionally and personally and kept most of what he observed to himself. You can go. They walked out onto the main road. The afternoon had gone gray and cold, the sun somewhere behind a flat ceiling of cloud that was doing nothing interesting and everything uncomfortable. The town had a post-crisis texture to it. People still in clusters, voices still carrying the extra energy of something significant having happened. The story already being told in its several versions by the several people who had been there. Rowan walked slowly because the shoulder made walking fast inadvisable, and Eliza walked beside him and matched his pace without making a performance of it. You should go home, she said. Sleep. I have to bank the forge. I know after that. He looked at her sideways. Are you managing me? Yes, she said simply. Is it working? Probably. They reached the smithy. She stopped at the door, didn't come in, just stood at the threshold the way she had that first day, which felt like a different year now, a different arrangement of the world. Rowan, she said. He stopped. Don't wait too long, she said. To say what you need to say, whatever it is. A pause, and then something that might have been the beginning of a smile, carefully managed. I'm a patient person, but I'm not a statue. She left, and he stood in the doorway of his smithy and watched her walk up the road until she turned the corner, and then he went inside and banked the fire and went to the two-room house behind the shop and lay down on his back with his bandaged hand across his chest, and was asleep in 4 minutes. He slept for 14 hours. He woke to gray morning light and the sound of wind and the immediate inventory of damage that his body conducted without being asked. Shoulder stiff and specific in its complaint, left hand tender around the stitches, right wrist tight under the bandaging, general background exhaustion that had been waiting for permission to arrive and had now settled in thoroughly. He lay still for a while, looking at the ceiling. He thought about what Eliza had said. Don't wait too long, which was a thing you said to someone you were still expecting something from, which meant the door he had been certain was closed or should be closed or ought to be closed out of some misguided sense of what she deserved. That door was not closed. He'd known that, if he was honest. He'd known it on the bank, standing in the cold with a blanket over his shoulders and blood on his palm and the creek running loud behind them. He'd known it earlier than that. He'd been knowing it and refusing to let the knowing mean anything for weeks, maybe longer. The problem was not, he understood lying there in the gray morning, that he didn't feel it. The problem was that feeling it and believing he was allowed to act on it were two different things, and the distance between them had been the whole geography of his self-doubt. Every scar, every debt, every early morning and empty acknowledgement, every time he'd fixed something for someone who didn't bother to say thank you, and told himself that was fine, that was enough. That was the shape of his life. He sat up. The shoulder protested. He let it protest. He spent the first part of the morning doing what Henshaw had cleared him to do. Light work, one-handed, the kind of maintenance and preparation that needed doing but didn't require force. He cleaned and reorganized his tool wall. He sharpened files. He made a list of the jobs backlogged from the week and arranged them in order of urgency. Colt came by around 9, which he'd probably been timing because Colt had always had good instincts about when to arrive and when to stay away. He came inside without ceremony, looked at Rowan's bandaged hand, and sat down on the stool near the door that visiting men gravitated to without being directed. How's the shoulder? Colt asked. Functional? And the hand? Stitched, 5 days before real work. Colt nodded, turning his hat in his hands the way he did when he was thinking about how to say something. Pete Calloway's been telling the story to everyone who'll stand still long enough to hear it, Colt said. His version's gotten bigger every telling. By tomorrow, you'll have freed 20 horses and rebuilt the bridge with your bare hands while on fire. Accurate, Rowan said. Colt smiled briefly and then went quiet again, the hat still moving. I talked to Eliza last night, Colt said. Properly. Rowan waited. I'm not going to tell you what she said because it's hers to say, and she'll say it better. Colt set the hat on his knee and looked up. But I want to say something to you first, and I want you to hear it as coming from a friend and not as, I don't know, whatever you'd otherwise make it into. All right. I'm not stepping back because you jumped in a river, Colt said. I'm not stepping back because the town's talking about you like you hung the moon, which they are, and it won't last, but for right now they are. And I'm not stepping back because I lost something. He paused. I'm stepping back because I've known you for 12 years, and you have spent most of those years carrying things that weren't yours to carry alone, and refusing to let anyone stand beside you while you did it. And I'm stepping back because the one person who figured out how to stand there anyway is someone worth not getting in the way of. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. That's a generous way to frame it, he said finally. It's an accurate way to frame it. Colt picked up his hat. She's good, Rowan. Not good like easy. Good like real. The kind of person who sees you clearly and stays anyway, which is rarer than it should be. He stood. Don't talk yourself out of it. I've watched you talk yourself out of everything good that ever got close to you, and I'm tired of watching it. You're tired of watching it, Rowan said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not quite humor, but adjacent to it. Genuinely exhausted, Colt said. 12 years. He put his hat on and walked out, and the door swung shut behind him, and Rowan sat in the quiet of the smithy for a while with the sound of the fire and the wind outside and nothing demanding anything from him for once. He thought about 12 years. He thought about how long it took to build a story about yourself and how much harder it was to take it apart than to take apart an iron structure. Because iron at least told you honestly where it was cracked. People, he specifically, had a gift for maintaining the surface long past the point where the interior had failed. The bracket, he thought again, and almost laughed at himself. He lasted until 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was more like the absence of continuing to make the opposite decision. The thing that happens when you've held a weight long enough that your arms give out, not from weakness, but from the simple exhaustion of maintaining the effort. He put on his coat. He checked the forge. He walked out the door and north up the main road toward the schoolhouse. The afternoon session would be ending. He knew her schedule without having been told it directly, assembled from weeks of incidental observation, the way he knew most things about Dry Mesa. Sideways, through accumulated detail. He was 50 yards from the schoolhouse when the door opened and children came out in the usual afternoon eruption. Coats half-buttoned, voices loud, the immediate dispersion of small people freed from the obligation of sitting still. Bobby Marsh came out in the middle of the group, hand in his coat pocket in the way he always stood when the iron horse was in there, which was always. Bobby saw Rowan and stopped walking. The other children streamed around him and dispersed. Bobby stood on the schoolhouse steps and looked at Rowan with those serious brown eyes, and then looked at the bandage on Rowan's left hand, and then looked back at his face. "You fixed the bridge," Bobby said. "Part of it," Rowan said. "It needs more work." "My pa said you went under the water." For a little while, Bobby considered this. "Were you scared?" Rowan thought about giving the answer that sounded better, then decided against it. "Yes," he said. Bobby nodded slowly, processing this information with the gravity it deserved. "But you went anyway." "The job needed doing." "Yeah." Bobby seemed to find this satisfying in a deep way. He put his hand back in his pocket, and Rowan knew the iron horse was in there, and neither of them said anything about it. "Miss Rowan's still inside," Bobby offered. "She's cleaning the board." "Thank you, Bobby." Bobby went down the steps and trotted off toward home, and Rowan stood in the cold for a moment and then went up the steps and opened the schoolhouse door. Eliza had her back to him, erasing the day's work from the blackboard. Long division problems on one side, a list of spelling words on the other, and Bobby's latest horse drawing that she'd apparently let him put up in the corner, a new one, bigger than the last. She heard the door and turned, chalk dust on her hands. and looked at him standing in the doorway with his coat on and his bandaged hand and whatever was visible on his face that he'd stopped trying to manage. "Rowan," she said, careful, not surprised. "I need to say something," he said, "and I'm going to say it badly, probably, because I've had this conversation in my head about 40 times in the last 3 weeks, and in my head it goes better than things usually go when I actually open my mouth." She set down the eraser and turned to face him fully, and she didn't make it easier by saying anything, which was exactly like her and exactly right. "I have been deciding things for you," he said. "What you deserve. What you'd choose if you saw clearly. What the right outcome was and who belongs in it. I've been doing that while telling myself it was consideration, or practicality, or me knowing my own limits." He stopped. It wasn't. It was fear. Just fear with better excuses than most fear comes with. The classroom was quiet. Outside, a horse went by on the road and the sound faded. "I don't have much," he said. "I have a smithy that's mine, and a house that's small, and debts that are getting smaller but aren't gone. I have hands that look like this." He lifted the bandaged left one slightly. "I have work that nobody notices until it isn't done, and I've made peace with that mostly. I'm not looking for notice." He paused. "But I am. I notice you. I have been noticing you since the first day you walked in with that hinge and stayed to ask about the fire, and I've been taking everything I noticed and using it to build a case for why I should stay where I was and let things be arranged the way I thought they should be arranged. And I'm done with that." She was watching him with that quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. Full, still, not performing a reaction. "I'm not telling you what to do with any of that," he said. "I told myself I was being noble, letting you decide without my interference. But I wasn't letting you decide. I was deciding for you by making sure you never had all the information." He exhaled. "So, now you have it." He stopped talking. The silence lasted several seconds, which felt architecturally significant. Eliza walked toward him slowly, unhurried, and stopped about 3 feet away, close enough that he could see the chalk dust on her sleeve and the particular expression on her face that he now recognized as her not performing anything expression, which was the most honest one. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. That first day, the hinge. You told me it had been failing for weeks before it gave out, from the pattern of the break." "Yes." "When did you know?" "Looking at it for the first time." 30 seconds, he said. "Maybe less." "And you knew exactly what the real problem was, not the obvious one." "The pin was the obvious problem. The bent plate from forced closures was the real one." She nodded as if this confirmed something. "I've been thinking about that for 6 weeks, she said. "About how you do that. See the real problem under the obvious one. And I've been watching you fail to do it exactly once." She held his gaze. "With yourself." "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "That's why you're here." She reached out and took his unbandaged right hand, carefully, around the wrist where the burn wasn't, and held it in both of hers the way you'd hold something you were checking the weight of. "Rowan Hale," she said, "I have been waiting for you to walk through that door for 3 weeks. Not because I had nothing else to think about. I had a classroom full of children and a broken boiler and Bobby Marsh's ongoing campaign to replace arithmetic with horse drawing. But I have been waiting because you are the most worth waiting for person I have met since I got off that stage in November, and I was not going to be the one to close the door on that." He stood very still. "Now," she said, and her voice had shifted into something drier, which was how he'd learned she sounded when she was most sincere, the emotion going sideways into tone rather than volume. "Was there more you wanted to say, or was that the whole speech?" "I think that was most of it," he said. "Then I accept," she said, "whatever it is you were offering, even the parts you didn't know how to say." He looked at her, at the chalk on her sleeve, the directness in her eyes, the slight cold redness of her nose from a schoolhouse that was only marginally warmer than outside, the fact of her standing in front of him holding his wrist like she'd already decided and was just waiting for him to catch up. He had spent 6 weeks building the case for why this couldn't work. And 12 years before that building, the case for why he wasn't the kind of man things like this happened to. He was a man who fixed things. He was a man who kept fires burning so other things could function. He was the answer to a problem, not the person someone chose, except that she was choosing him. had chosen him, apparently, before he'd walked through the door today, before the bridge, before the hinge on our first day in Dry Mesa, had been choosing him in the small, patient ways that he'd noticed and refused to let himself count. He thought about the note in his drawer. Your hands are what keep this town running. He thought about 25 cents for a 20-cent job, about a hidden crate of books, about a woman who stood at his doorway in the orange light and watched the fire and didn't need him to be anything other than what he was. All right, he said, which was not the most eloquent response to one of the more significant moments of his life, and he knew it, and she laughed. A real one, not performed, short and warm, and entirely like her. All right, she agreed. The cold was doing what it did outside, pressing at the windows, laying itself flat over the plains. In the schoolhouse, the small boiler ticked and breathed and kept the worst of it at bay. They stood there together, neither of them moving to fill the moment with anything it didn't need. His shoulder ached. His hand ached. He was still, underneath everything, tired in the bone-deep way of a man who had been in cold water and had not entirely recovered, and would not entirely recover for another few days. He was also, in a way that had nothing to do with any of that, less tired than he'd been in years, as if something that had required constant effort to maintain had simply stopped requiring it, had been set down, had rested its weight somewhere it was supposed to rest. He stayed at the schoolhouse until the boiler needed stoking, and he stoked it because he was there and he could, and she didn't tell him it was unnecessary. They talked, not about anything weighted, just talk, the kind that fills a room without demanding anything, the kind he'd forgotten he was capable of because most of his conversations were about what needed to be fixed and when. She told him about Philadelphia in winter, which was apparently loud and gray and crowded in ways that were both worse and better than Dry Mesa's particular kind of cold. He told her about the summer he'd spent at 16 trying to learn to ride a horse properly and failing comprehensively, which made her laugh again. And laughing at himself he found less like losing something than he'd expected. He walked home in the early dark, and the cold was what it was, and the forge was waiting, and when he got back he built the fire up and stood at it for a while. Not working, just standing, letting the heat come back into his hands and his face. Outside, Dry Mesa was settling into its evening. Smoke from chimneys, lights in windows, the sounds of a town at the end of a day. Ordinary, unremarkable. The same sounds it made every night, only he was not, entirely, the same person who had been hearing them. The fire burned steady in its box, the way it always burned, patient, reliable, waiting for what was needed. He watched it for a while, the orange and gold of it, the quality of light it made that he'd lived inside for years without really seeing. He thought about what this town would look like in 6 months, a year. The bridge needed real work, weeks of it, proper structural repair, materials the council would have to authorize and he would have to build. Winter needed getting through. The jobs piled up on his ledger needed working through one by one, the way they always were. None of that had changed. But there was a schoolhouse a half-mile north, where the boiler ticked and the chalk dust settled on the shelves, and Bobby Marsh's horse looked down from the corner wall, and a woman who had arrived on a stage in November with a broken hinge and a question about fires and a way of paying attention that had undone, without trying to, 6 years of very careful distance. Rowan added a log to the forge. The fire took it without complaint. He went to bed at a reasonable hour for once, and the cold outside was just cold, and the dark was just dark. And in the morning, there would be work. There was always work. But for the first time in a long time, that felt less like the whole of it. Part 5. Lưu ý. Viết 3.000 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Việt như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sảng. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện.
câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đan bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dụng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh, không mở rộng nội dung.
Show more part 5. What the fire kept. The stitches came out on the 5th day of work, as Henshaw had said they could, and Rowan was back at the forge with both hands the morning after. The shoulder took longer, a full 10 days before he could swing a hammer on the right side without the muscle seizing in protest. But he'd worked around it, left-handed where he could, lighter work where he couldn't, the jobs moving slower than he liked, but moving. The town council met on the 22nd of December, 3 days after the flood, called to emergency session by Sheriff Pruitt, who had apparently discovered a talent for urgency once an event large enough embarrassed him into it. Rowan was asked to attend, which was unusual. The council didn't typically consult tradesmen on infrastructure matters, preferring to make decisions about things it didn't understand without the inconvenience of someone who did. He went, because not going would have been the kind of stubborn that cost other people. The council chamber was the back room of the courthouse. 6 men around a table that was slightly too small for 6 men and their collective self-importance. Rowan sat in a chair against the wall and laid out what needed to be done with the bridge, plainly, without theater, the way he would have explained a repair to anyone paying attention. The eastern span needed full structural replacement. 3 of the main beams were compromised, not one. The bracket system throughout was undersized for the traffic load the bridge had been carrying for the past 5 years. The plank decking needed to come up entirely and be relaid on a corrected frame. "How long?" asked Alderman Pierce, who was the least useless of the 6. 6 weeks of work, if I have a laborer, and the materials budget is adequate. 8 if I'm working alone. And the cost? Rowan had the figure written down. He'd spent 2 evenings calculating it, going back through it twice to make sure he hadn't padded it in either direction. He handed the paper to Pierce. Pierce looked at it, passed it to the man beside him. The paper made its way around the table with the varied expressions of men confronting a number that was inconvenient, but not, ultimately, deniable. "The county can contribute toward materials," said Councilman Hatch, who controlled the county purse and had never once contributed toward anything without making the contributor feel the weight of the generosity. "Half the materials cost." "The other half?" Rowan said. "Town fund," said Pruitt. "We'll cover the labor as well, at the standard day rate." "Standard day rate for bridge construction isn't what it is for 1.25 standard," Pierce said, which was Pierce shortcutting what would otherwise have become a 40-minute negotiation. "Labor and materials covered. You start in January when the ground permits." Rowan looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "All right," which was the same thing he'd said in Eliza's schoolhouse and carried, this time, a different but related weight, the weight of a man who had decided to stop treating acceptance as surrender. He also mentioned, before he left, that 2 of the drainage culverts on the North Road were backing up and would flood the road in spring if they weren't cleared, and that the iron bracket on the livery stable's main door had been cracking for 6 months and was a liability waiting to happen. The council wrote both items down with the expressions of men who are writing things down so they don't have to say they'll do something about them. Rowan walked out into the cold December street and decided that was the best he was going to get, and that the best he was going to get was considerably better than what he'd had 3 weeks ago, and that this was how things actually improved, not in gestures, not in sudden transformations, but in the incremental, unsexy accumulation of small concessions from people who would rather not make them. He could work with that. Christmas Eve arrived on a Wednesday, and Dry Mesa did what it always did: decorated modestly, cooked extensively, and organized itself around the social calendar with the intensity of a community that understood isolation and therefore took its celebrations seriously. There was a gathering at the community hall on the evening of the 24th, the kind of event where everyone came because not coming would have required an explanation. Rowan went. He was not by nature a community hall gathering kind of man. He stood near the edge of things, held a drink he mostly didn't touch, and observed. But he noticed this year that the edge of things felt different than it usually did, less like the position of someone who didn't belong, and more like the position of someone who was just taking a moment before moving in. The difference was subtle. It lived mostly inside him. May Dawson found him within 10 minutes, which was inevitable. "You look better than I expected," she said, examining him with the candor of someone who had passed the age at which social filters served a purpose. "I feel better than I expected," he said. "Eliza Rowan is here." She said it with a studied neutrality that communicated she had been waiting to say it and had prepared the neutrality in advance. "I know," he said. "I saw her when I came in." May looked at him. He looked back. She seemed to decide she had done enough and moved off toward a cluster of women near the refreshment table, and Rowan allowed himself a small exhale. Eliza was across the hall, talking to the Harmon family, standing straight in a green dress he hadn't seen before that suited her in the way that things suited Eliza. Simply, without effort, as if it had always been there. She caught his eye across the room and something passed between them that required no translation. And then she went back to her conversation with the Harmons, and he went back to standing at the edge of his. Colt was there too, of course. Dry Mesa was 400 people. There wasn't a social gathering where Colt wasn't present and generally appreciated. He came to stand beside Rowan at the wall with his own drink, and they stood there together the way they'd been standing near things together since they were boys, comfortable in the particular way of old acquaintance. "Town's treating you well," Colt said. It was true. 3 separate people had shaken his hand since he walked in. Pete Calloway had embraced him with the force of a man who had been nearly killed and was still processing the gratitude through his body rather than his words. Even Harmon, who had underpaid him for 3 years and never offered a voluntary thank you, had clapped him on the shoulder and said he'd done a hell of a thing, which from Harmon was practically a poem. "It'll fade," Rowan said. "Some of it," Colt agreed. "The useful part won't." Rowan looked at him. "People here know what you did," Colt said. "Not just the bridge, all of it. May talks. Henshaw talks. No, not about medical things, but May had already told everyone Henshaw's business before Henshaw got to it. The widows you didn't charge. The stoves. The toys." He paused. "Bobby Marsh told his father you said you were scared before you went in the water. His father told me. He said it was the most honest thing he'd heard about courage in 20 years. Rowan looked at his drink. "The bridge work," Colt said. "Council approved it. 1.25 day rate. Materials covered." "Good." A pause. "You need a laborer for 6 weeks. I've got a ranch hand finishing a contract in January who's good with his hands and needs the work. I'll send him your way." Rowan looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Colt said. "That's not the point." He took a drink. "The point is that you built something here for years without anyone building anything back in your direction, and some of us are overdue on that." He said it without weight, without drama, the way he said most true things, just putting it down in the space between them and leaving it there. Rowan didn't know how to answer that, so he said, "Thank you, Colt." "You're welcome," Colt said, and that was the whole of it. Later, he found Eliza by the door where she'd stepped away from the crowd for a moment, holding her drink and looking out the hall's narrow window at the dark street. Snow had started falling, the real kind this time, thick and soft, covering the packed dirt of Main Street in a quiet white that made the whole town look temporarily more generous than it was. "It's snowing," she said when he came to stand beside her. "I see that. I didn't have a white Christmas in Philadelphia last year. The city was too warm." She watched the snow for a moment. "This is better." "Colder." "Better," she said again firmly, which made him smile. They stood at the window together, and the party moved behind them, and the snow fell out in front, and neither of them felt the need to fill it with anything. "I have something for Bobby Marsh," Rowan said. She turned to look at him. "Finished it last week. Iron horse, bigger than the first one, more detailed. His Christmas gift." He paused. "I was going to leave it on the schoolhouse steps." Eliza looked at him for a moment. "You were going to leave it anonymously." "It was going to be from Rowan." Her tone was kind but not gentle about it. "He knows it's you. He has known it was you since the first horse. He just respects you too much to say so out loud, which you would appreciate if you thought about it." He had thought about it. That was, he admitted to himself, exactly why he'd liked the 7-year-old from the beginning. "I'll bring it by tomorrow morning," he said. Before he wakes up, leave it on the step. You could knock on the door, she said. Like a person. I could. But you won't. I'll knock on the door, he said, which surprised them both mildly. She looked at him with the particular expression she wore when something confirmed a long-held estimate. Good, she said. They stayed at the window until the snow had covered the street completely, and then they went back inside. And the rest of the evening was not remarkable in any single way, and entirely remarkable as a whole, the way evenings sometimes are when you are paying attention to them for the right reasons. He woke on Christmas morning at 4, the way he always woke, and lay still for 3 full minutes fighting the habit of getting up. Then he got up, because the forge wouldn't stoke itself, and dressed in the cold and went to the smithy. The iron horse was wrapped in cloth on the work table where he'd left it. He'd spent the better part of 3 evenings on it, not because Bobby needed the finest craftsmanship Rowan was capable of, but because something about making it right mattered to him in a way he hadn't tried to reason through. The horse was rearing, both front hooves raised, the body caught mid-motion. It was about 9 inches tall. The legs were anatomically correct. He'd looked at the picture in Eliza's book to make sure. He stood at the work table and looked at it for a moment, and thought about a 7-year-old who kept a small iron horse in his pocket every single day and checked the legs against a picture in a borrowed book. He thought about what Colt had told him Bobby's father had said, the most honest thing about courage in 20 years, that he'd been scared and gone anyway. It had not felt, in the moment, like courage. It had felt like arithmetic, like the only calculation that kept Pete Calloway alive required him to be in the water, so he'd gotten in the water. The fear had been real, but it hadn't been the deciding factor. Maybe that was what courage actually was. Not the absence of the fear, but the fear being present and the arithmetic overriding it. Not a grand decision, but a simple one, made in the time it took to read the situation. He'd spent 6 weeks being afraid of Eliza Rowan. Not of her, but of what wanting something from her would cost if he let himself want it and turned out to be wrong about his own worth. That arithmetic had taken him longer to get right, but he'd gotten there. He wrapped the horse in cloth again and put it in his coat pocket and walked through the pre-dawn dark toward the Marsh House, which was 3 blocks north of the main road, a small clapboard place with a porch that listed slightly to the left, and a woodpile that Rowan had noticed in passing was getting thin. He filed that away. He left the horse on the front step, wrapped, with no note, because a note would have been beside the point. Then he stood back in the street for a moment and looked at it sitting there in the cold, and felt something that wasn't satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction was too simple. It was more like rightness, like a bracket set correctly in its mounting, holding what it was supposed to hold, no flex where there shouldn't be any. He walked back through the quiet, snow-covered town. The sky was doing the thing it did before winter dawn, lightening at the edges without committing to it, a gray that was almost blue, a dark that was almost over. The street was empty, undisturbed, tracks and wagon ruts all softened and smoothed under last night's snow into something that looked almost like a beginning. The forge was waiting. He built the fire up and watched it take. The first catch of the kindling, the way the flame moved along the dried wood with that quick, purposeful intelligence, and then the coals beginning to glow and the heat building, the whole reliable sequence that he'd watched 10,000 times and still found, on the right morning, worth watching. He stood there with his hands extended toward the warmth, the bandaging finally off for good now, the new skin on his palm pink and tight and still slightly tender, the stitching line a thin, clean seam that would fade over the months into just another mark among the others. He looked at his hands in the growing firelight and thought, not for the first time, about Eliza's note. Your hands are what keep this town running. He'd put the note in the drawer with the important papers, and it was still there, and he thought it would stay there for a long time. Dry Mesa woke slowly on Christmas morning. He could hear it through the open side door. Not the work sounds of ordinary days, but the particular sounds of a town allowing itself to rest. Children's voices somewhere, excited at that high early morning pitch. A door, then another. The smell of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys. Around 8 o'clock, he heard running footsteps on the road outside. Then a small, emphatic voice saying something he couldn't quite make out. And then a woman's voice. Bobby's mother, he thought. And then a pause. And then Bobby's voice again, closer, just outside the smithy door. Rowan kept his back to the door, and worked the bellows. "Mr. Hale!" He turned around.
Bobby Marsh was standing in the smithy doorway in his coat and boots, and a wool hat that had been put on in a hurry, still slightly crooked. He was holding the iron horse with both hands, the cloth unwrapped, the rearing horse catching the orange light of the forge. His face was the face of a 7-year-old who has received exactly the thing he wanted and doesn't yet have the adult instinct to manage the feeling of it. Open and overwhelmed and trying to be serious about it because he was the kind of boy who took important things seriously. "It's rearing up," Bobby said. "That's how I made it," Rowan said. "The legs are right." Bobby looked up from the horse. "I checked." "I know you did." Bobby looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Were you the one who made the first one too? The small one?" Rowan considered lying, out of habit. The habit lost. "Yes," he said. Bobby nodded. He seemed to have expected this answer and had decided how to receive it in advance, with the same preparation Rowan brought to knowing where a bracket would fail. "Thank you," Bobby said, with a gravity that had nothing childish in it. "Both times." "You're welcome," Rowan said. "Both times." Bobby looked at the horse once more, and then at the forge, and then back at Rowan. "My pa said you were the one who fixed the bridge, before the flood and during it." "Worked on it, yes." "He said without you, Pete Calloway would have died." Bobby shifted his weight. "He said we don't say that kind of thing enough, about people who do that kind of thing." Rowan stood at his forge on Christmas morning with a 7-year-old in his doorway delivering a message that the boy's father had clearly rehearsed with him, and felt without any ambiguity that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "You can tell your father thank you," Rowan said, "and tell him his woodpile is getting thin. I'll bring a cord of wood by next week." Bobby blinked. "He didn't ask for that." "No," Rowan agreed. Bobby seemed to understand that this was the whole answer, because he was, at 7, already smart enough to understand how Rowan operated. He tucked the horse against his chest, thanked him again, and ran back up the road toward home. The forge burned on. Eliza came by mid-morning, which he'd been expecting without quite letting himself say so. She had her blue coat and her slightly crooked scarf, and she came inside without ceremony and stood near the forge, the way she always stood near the forge. "Bobby found his horse," she said. "I heard him. He came to school. He came to my door. I was at the boarding house. He came to my door at 8 in the morning on Christmas to show me." She was smiling in the way she smiled when something genuine had gotten past her composure. He said the legs were right. "I checked the picture," Rowan said. She looked at him. "He checks the picture," Rowan said. "So I checked the picture." She was quiet for a moment, and the smile was still there, but had changed into something quieter. "You know," she said, "most people give gifts they'd want to receive. You give gifts the other person actually needs." "The horse wasn't about need," Rowan said. "It was about... Bobby carries the first one in his pocket every day. He earned the second one." "That's what I mean," she said. They stood at the forge on Christmas morning, and the fire between them was warm, and outside the snow from the night before was beginning to melt off the roof edges in thin, irregular drips, and Dry Mesa was doing what it did on holidays, being human, being imperfect, being alive in the specific ordinary way of 400 people who had chosen this difficult country and were making the best of it. "I want to ask you something," Rowan said. She waited. "You came from Philadelphia," he said. "You had a life there, people you knew, libraries." He paused. "Is this..." He gestured, not at the smithy specifically, but at all of it. The town visible through the open door, the plains beyond it, the whole wide, cold, unglamorous fact of Dry Mesa. "Is this enough? Is this..." "Rowan, I need to ask it." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "Yes. Not because it's perfect. It isn't, and I wouldn't trust it if it were. The winters are long and the library situation is genuinely poor, and Pete Calloway is going to be telling the bridge story for 20 years, and the details will get worse every time." She paused. "But the school is mine. The children are real. May Dawson's book crate exists because someone worth knowing told me where to look." She held his gaze. "And you are here, which is not a small thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. For the third time in recent weeks, those two words carrying everything he knew how to mean. "All right," she said back. "The winter settled in properly after Christmas, the deep kind.
the kind that stopped pretending to be temporary and became the whole texture of the world for months. The bridge work waited for January thaw, the way Rowan had said it would. And in the meantime, the town used the North Road and complained about it and managed. Rowan worked. That was what he did. He worked through the cold, short days and the long, dark evenings, and the jobs came in the way jobs always came. Some easy, some not. Some from people who appreciated it, and some from people who didn't, which was the same proportion it had always been, and always would be. But things were different in the ways that mattered. He started eating at the diner on Thursdays, which was a small thing, but he hadn't done it before because he'd told himself he was too busy, which was a lie he'd been telling himself for 3 years. May Dawson started leaving an extra biscuit with his orders without charging him for it and denying any knowledge of it when he mentioned it. He found a proper medical text in the book crate, one that actually covered forge injuries, and started reading it in the evenings, which Eliza said was the most Rowan thing she'd ever heard, and she meant it as a compliment. The bridge work started in late January, when the ground firmed enough to work the pilings. Colt's ranch hand turned out to be a solid worker named Felix, 24, careful, the kind of man who asked questions when he didn't understand something rather than pretending he did, which Rowan appreciated above most professional qualities. They worked well together. The job took 7 weeks instead of 6, because 2 of the beams were worse than Rowan had estimated once they got them out. Rot had gotten further in than the surface showed, but they finished clean, and when they finished, the bridge was better than it had been in a decade. Pruitt authorized the work, and the town paid the materials and the labor rate, which surprised Rowan only in the timing. The check arrived without his asking for it, without a reminder, which he had not expected. He framed the check stub in his head as evidence that institutions could occasionally be surprised into doing the right thing. He kept the actual check and used it to clear the last of the debt from the shop transfer, which he had been carrying for 2 years. He sat with the cleared ledger for a few minutes in the quiet of the evening, looking at the row of numbers that now ended in 0. He had not realized until the weight was gone how long he had been carrying it. Spring came to Dry Mesa the way spring came to the Texas plains. Not gently, not in the soft incremental way of gentler climates, but with a kind of raw announcement, the cold breaking over 3 days, and then the temperature jumping 20 degrees, and the ground softening fast, and the whole world smelling like mud and possibility, and the specific restlessness of things that had been held still too long. The schoolhouse needed new steps. The old ones had heaved over the winter, frost working under the risers, and 2 of the boards had split. Rowan rebuilt them on a Saturday in late March, with Eliza watching from the doorway in the way she'd watched him work since November, and Bobby Marsh and 2 other children sitting on the fence across the road, offering opinions no one had asked for. "That one's not level," Bobby said, pointing at the middle step. "It's level," Rowan said. "It looks lower on the left." "Bobby," Rowan said, "do you want to come check it with a level?" Bobby considered this for a moment, then said yes, with the seriousness of a man accepting a professional responsibility. Rowan handed him the level. Bobby set it on the step, checked the bubble, and handed it back without comment. "Level," Bobby confirmed. "Thank you," Rowan said. Bobby went back to the fence, satisfied, and the other children went back to whatever they'd been doing, and Eliza, in the doorway, was doing the careful not smiling that she did when something amused her enough that she was managing it. "He's going to be a problem," Rowan said quietly. "He's going to be excellent," Eliza said. "Those are sometimes the same thing." He finished the steps. They held level, all 3 of them, which was exactly what steps were supposed to do. Later, walking back toward the smithy in the mild March afternoon, the light still sharp but carrying warmth for the first time in months, the street beginning to dry out from the thaw. Rowan thought about the story Pete Calloway was still telling, which was true, and the things the town had begun to understand about who kept it running, which were also true, and the bridge that was now solid where it had been failing, and Bobby Marsh's iron horse, and May Dawson's extra biscuit, and a note in a drawer that said, "Your hands are what keep this town running." He thought about all the years he'd spent being invisible by choice. Not by circumstance, by choice, because choice was the armor. If you decided first that you didn't matter, nobody else's failure to notice you could be a wound. You'd already administered the wound yourself, preemptively, and called it practicality. The cost of that, he thought, was not the isolation. Isolation he'd been fine with. The cost was what you convinced yourself wasn't real in order to maintain it. The warmth you talked yourself out of feeling, the belonging you reframed as distraction. The woman asking about the fire who you almost convinced yourself was asking about a fire. He was 32 years away from being Bobby Marsh. He was 12 years from being Colt's childhood acquaintance standing at the edge of the social hall. He was 6 months from a broken hinge and a question about whether the fire ever went out. He was here now, in March, with the mud of spring on his boots and the weight of the winter's last debt finally gone, and the sound of the forge waiting for him a block away. Patient, reliable, the way it had always been patient and reliable, the way he had been patient and reliable, and had only recently begun to let that mean something. The plains stretched out past the edge of town, wide and honest and indifferent, the way they always stretched. The sky above them was the particular deep blue that came on clear spring afternoons, the kind of blue that was hard to look at directly. Rowan looked at it anyway. Then he went back to the forge and built the fire up and went to work. The fire, as always, was already warm. It had been there all along, keeping the heat against the cold, waiting for morning. The way certain things wait, not passively but with purpose, the way the best things hold. He had been that fire for this town for years without knowing anyone was watching the light. Turns out, someone was. Turns out, that was enough.